Professor Akram here, and in this tutorial we're going to go over creating and applying materials in 3D Studio Max. As you can see in Max, we've modeled a scene with some brefcus, but we want to make this brefcus a little tastier. So to do that, we're going to add materials. And to add materials, we're going to open up our slate material editor. And I'm going to go up to the material editor right there and click on it. And this will open up the slate material editor, and I'm going to go over some of the parts of the editor here. So up at the very top we have our main menu here, then we have our toolbar followed by the materials maps browser, and then over down at the very bottom here we have the status bar, we have the active view, which is where you'll do a lot of your material creations. Then over down here we have the navigation tools where we can zoom in and out of our materials. We have the parameters editor and we have the navigator, and a lot of this will make more sense as we start playing around with the materials. The way materials work is it is a node based system where you have a material and you apply texture maps to different inputs of the materials, changing the settings. And like I said, we're going to go through and we're going to make a couple of these. As you can see here, we actually have a material in our active view from when we were creating some of the pieces of our brefcus, in this case the bacon. We brought in an image as a reference that we could trace. I'm gonna set this aside for right now. We're actually gonna bring in a material from a library. So as you start making materials, there are times where you might want to reuse a material in a different project. And to do that, you have to create a library and then you can export that library. So if I go up to my materials maps and click on the little drop down, you can see that I can choose open material library, and in my materials library folder I have a brefcus library material. I'm going to hit open here. Inside of my materials maps over here, you can see I now have a material listed under brefcus library map that says teak wood, and if I drag it out to my scene, you're not going to see much. And this is because, again, we are bringing in a library from a different project that we've copied over. So this is also important. Whenever you do create a library, all the library saves are the settings of how the maps are applied to the material. It doesn't save the actual map. So what we have to do is we need to make sure that the library itself is copied into our project, as well as the texture maps. So in my case, this bitmap does not know what the link is. So if I double click on this, it'll bring up the texture map parameters over in the parameters dialog. And you can see that it's looking for some folder here, but I want to tell it where the folder is in my project. And again, I have to move that file into my project. So I'm just going to click there and it's going to give me some lost directory. I'm actually going to direct it to my folder, to scene assets, images, and this is where I've copied the teak wood bitmap. So again, material libraries record the information about how things are set up, but it doesn't actually save the bitmap files. Those have to be physically added to your project. And again, all we did was update that parameter there. Now, if I want to add this material to a scene, there's a couple of different ways that I can do that. So as you can tell, this is a wood texture material and I want to add it to my tabletop. So in one of my scenes here, I'm going to go to the front view, I'm going to select my tabletop, and to assign it to the tabletop, I can click on the output button of the material and drag it to that tabletop. Now, one thing you'll notice, if you have a really full scene, you may not be able to drag and drop it that easily. So another method is to right click on the material and tell it to assign to the selection. Now, if you're looking at it inside of the perspective view, you'll notice that it's not showing up quite right. Obviously, we're not seeing our wood texture. So if I come back over here in my material editor, a couple of things you want to check for right off the bat. You're going to right click on your material and you're going to make sure that shaded material in viewport and show realistic material in viewport are both turned on. Otherwise you won't see it at all. So we've got those both turned on, so that's working. So this means the material is not laying on the object correctly. So for this to work, we need to add a UVW map on our object. With my tabletop object selected, I'm going to go up to the Modify tab and I'm going to click on the drop down here and I'm going to choose UVW Map. You can use a couple of different types of maps. A planar map just wraps it from the top down. Let's see what box does, because our tabletop is in fact a box. And you can also change the rotation or alignment of that box. So I'm going to go with X is not quite right. As you can see, the box is vertical. Y is not quite right. V is the one we want, and we'll do fit. So now one of the things we can do is we can check whether or not we need to set real world map settings on here. And this really has to do with some of your texture maps and how big they are and how big are they and relevant to the real world. So if we need to, we can check this to get the map to scale properly. And the minute I turn that check mark on, you can see that our material showed up in our scene. If I go back to the material editor, you can see I've got the bitmap still selected. It says map 24, it says map 24 right here. I can rename this. This just really helps me identifying the parameters a little bit better, what I'm looking at. In the parameters, you can see that I've got a couple of different things going on. You can also see how the grain of the wood is going, but what if I wanted to just go left and right? Well, this is where UVW come into play. So UVW is basically just XYZ, but for maps. And this is just a way to differentiate whether you're working with a model or working with a texture map. So in this case, we're going to represent them by UVW. And right now my V is rotated in the 90, but if I were to put this in 0, you can see that the material goes from left to right instead. And it really just depends on what you want to do and how you want your material to look. I'm going to go back to 90 here because I want mine going up and down. Now, a couple of other things in regards to this material. You'll notice that the bitmap is being applied to both the diffuse color and the bump map. So if I double click on the material, this will bring up the material settings. So what's happening here are the settings for the physical material. And as I said earlier, you can have multiple bitmaps, or in this case a single bitmap, applied to many different inputs. So right now it's set to our diffuse color and it's set to our bump map. If you look at the blend parameters here, you can see that my diffuse color is gray, but it's got an M here for a map. And that means that it's actually using a map. And you can see that it is using 100% of the map, meaning the texture map is 100% opaque. But if I were to bring this down, let's say to 50%, you'll notice that our table gets a little grayed out. That means that the map is only being applied at a 50% opacity and the rest of the material color is coming from the diffuse. So we can see this a little better if I change the diffuse color. So let me change it to like a green here. And you can already see that the table now is partially green. I'm going to hit cancel on that and I'm going to set my diffuse color back up to 100. There are many different inputs for maps to be applied to. One of the things that you can do is a bump map, and a bump map gives the illusion of texture on a model. What it's doing is taking a texture map and looking at the light and dark areas of the map, and anything that is dark is going to create sort of the illusion of those portions being higher. Typically you do this with a black and white image. It works a little better, but it can be done with any image. And right now we're looking at this at 30%, meaning that the bump map is only being applied about 30% strengths. But if I crank this up to really high, a lot of times with some of the settings that you apply to your materials, you're going to have to render your scene to see them applied. If I click on my viewport and I click on my render post-production, and you can see right here, this is how the texture is being applied. This is creating that illusion that we have a really rigid material on here. It could even imply that, you know, maybe this is like a picnic table that's been outside and it's weathered and beat up and things like that. So if I just move this off to the side and I take my bump map and bring it back down to 30 where it was originally and do a render a second time, you can see that my table is much smoother here. So if you wanted to create a material from scratch, basically over in your maps over here, you're going to typically, more often than not, create a material with a standard material. So I'm going to come over, double click on the standard material. We're going to call this material cup. This is the material for our cup. And there are different shader parameters. More often than not, you're going to use a blend material. And then you're going to either set up your color or set up your maps. And there are different ways to set up your maps. You can come over to the type of map that you want to bring in, and you can drag and drop it to, let's say, diffuse. If I wanted a bitmap on my diffuse, I can drag and drop it over there. Or over in the diffuse, I can click on this little square, and this will ask me what type of map I want to load to the diffuse channel. And then lastly, I can click on my rollout over here. I just want to add a diffuse map, which is the overall spread, and I want a bitmap. And it should, if you've set up your materials correctly and brought them in, your image assets for your materials should be located in your scene assets images folder. And I'm going to pick this tiled flannel material here. And I'm going to click on my cup here, and I'm going to right click on the material and tell it to assign to selection. So now I've got my material on my cup. Notice that it shows up gray, and that is because I don't have my material turned on. I'm going to right click and I'm going to do show material in viewport and show realistic material in viewport. Another thing that you can do in order to tell whether the material has been assigned is if the object is selected, the material should have little white triangles inside the icon indicating that this is a material assigned to that object. The material is still not showing up in the viewport, so I'm going to add a UVW map to our model, and I'm going to play around with some of the settings as I showed in the example of the tabletop to get the material to display exactly how we want on the model. Now, your material does not have to be just a simple texture like here with just a simple texture of a flannel. Here we have a simple texture of the wood. Now, if we recall from the bacon, we had a photograph. If I double click on this, I can see a larger image of bacon on a plate. And I still want to use this image for my bacon pieces. I'm going to get to a point where I can see my bacon. I'm going to turn off a couple of things here. So now that I have my bacon in view, I'm going to go ahead and select it. I'm going to open up my slate editor. I am going to drag and drop that onto the bacon. Again, I'm not going to be able to see anything because a lot of times you're going to need a UVW to help determine how that material is going to be viewed. So inside of the Modify tab, I'm going to add a UVW map. Here is my bacon, and obviously I can see the plate, everything's weird. I'm going to close the editor. And I'm going to come over to my top view because this is really where I can see what's going on from the top perspective of the bacon. I'm going to turn top view into shade mode. I'm going to maximize the top view so I can get a better sense of this. So planar seems to work fairly well for what we want because it just wants to wrap it sort of on top like a sticker. But as you can see, the material is not quite right. If I go to my Modify tab over here under UVW Map, I can click on Gizmo. And this allows me to manipulate the tool, the gizmo, that controls how the UVW map is being applied. So now I've got my bacon sort of centered here, but again, I can still see the plate. So I can actually scale the UVW map. And I might also need to rotate this. And then once you're happy with how this looks, you can go back into your UVW map And I can minimize this, and there you go. There you have your bacon. Now, if we take a closer look over here, it has stretched it kind of funny and kind of unappetizing on the sides of the bacon. So what we can actually do here is we can add a different material to different parts of the object. So I'm going to go into the front view, and I'm actually going to turn off my eggs so I can just see the bacon itself. In order to add materials to different portions of the object, I need to get into a sub-object mode so I can select portions of the object. So I'm just going to stack our edit mesh on here. Edit mesh will allow me to select either vertices, edges, faces, polygons, or elements, and I want faces here. And in the front view here, I want to get the perimeter of this object all the way around. So I'm basically going to do a little window cropping where I select it. And it looks like I've selected it. I'm going to go ahead and go to the minimize and just make sure that I don't have the top surfaces selected. They would show up red. You can also see in the top view, I'm just getting a red outline all the way around. So this means that I only have the edges of this model selected. I'm going to go back into my slate editor here. I have a material called bacon sides that's got a texture map of just the side of the bacon, and I'm going to apply that to only of the faces which I have selected. Then I'm going to go ahead and add a UV map on top of this. And so again, this UV map is only being applied to the selection that I have selected, which you can see here are the faces. And in my case, I think cylindrical might be the best. I'm going to do fit. It's going to be hard to tell until we deselect this object. And as you can see, I've got a nice smooth edge here. It doesn't look all weird and wrapped funny, but a nice smooth edge of the material applied to this object. So once you've got all your materials set up to your liking, you can go ahead and render your scene to really assess how the materials look. So this was just a quick run through of how to create and apply materials in 3D Studio Max. The best way to learn about materials is to simply to play around with the settings and see what kind of material you come up with. I hope you found this lesson informative. And don't forget to check out other lessons and tutorials on the channel. So what are you waiting for? Get creative today.